The delivery room monitors were still beeping steadily behind her, and Camille Ashworth was holding her newborn daughter for the very first time, when she looked up to tell her husband to come closer, and found the doorway completely empty. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't said anything at all. Devon Ashworth had walked out of the hospital sometime between the epidural and the first cry, leaving behind nothing but a text message that would arrive on Camille's phone 40 minutes later, while a nurse was still helping her hold a baby whose father had already decided, before she'd even taken her first breath, that she couldn't possibly be his. "I know this isn't mine. I had a vasectomy 6 years ago. Don't contact me again." Camille read that message 3 times before the words fully registered, and in the 6 devastating years that followed, years spent raising a daughter alone, rebuilding a shattered reputation, absorbing whispers from people who believed exactly the story Devon had told them, she never once knew the truth her ex-husband had been hiding since before their daughter was even conceived. It would take a court-ordered paternity test, filed reluctantly during a child support dispute 6 years later, to finally expose it. And when the DNA results came back, they didn't just prove Devon Ashworth was his daughter's biological father. They exposed a secret so carefully constructed, so quietly maintained for nearly a decade, that it would collapse every relationship, every reputation, and every lie Devon Ashworth had spent his adult life protecting. Stay with me, because the truth in that report wasn't just about a baby. It was about exactly what kind of man Devon Ashworth had always been, and exactly how long he'd been getting away with it. Camille Ashworth had met Devon 9 years earlier at a mutual friend's engagement party, drawn immediately to his easy confidence and the particular attentiveness he brought to every conversation, the way he remembered small details she'd mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later, making her feel, in those early months, more genuinely seen than she'd ever felt by anyone before. Devon worked in commercial real estate development, ambitious and well-connected, the kind of man whose career trajectory seemed to promise exactly the stable, comfortable future Camille had always imagined for herself. They married 2 years into their relationship, in a wedding Devon's family had insisted on funding generously, and settled into a comfortable suburban life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the picture of a successful young marriage. What Camille didn't know in those early years was that Devon Ashworth had been quietly living an entirely separate life since 18 months before their wedding, a relationship with a woman named Vanessa Kirchner, a colleague at his development firm, conducted with the same careful, compartmentalized precision Devon brought to everything in his professional life. Devon had never intended to leave Vanessa. He had simply intended from the beginning to maintain both relationships indefinitely, marrying Camille for the stability, the social respectability, and, critically, the family connections her father's construction supply business provided to Devon's own career ambitions, while keeping Vanessa as the relationship he actually, privately, wanted. It was roughly 4 years into the marriage, during a period when Camille had begun gently raising the subject of starting a family, that Devon made the decision that would eventually unravel everything. He didn't want children with Camille, not because he didn't want children at all, but because he had already quietly begun discussing a future family with Vanessa, a future he had no intention of complicating by fathering a child within a marriage he privately viewed as a practical arrangement rather than a genuine partnership. So Devon told Camille, gently and with apparent regret, that recent medical tests had revealed a fertility issue on his end, that having biological children together simply wasn't going to be possible, and that he hoped she could find peace with adoption or simply accepting a child-free life together. What he didn't tell her was that he'd scheduled and undergone a vasectomy that same month, a procedure conducted at a clinic 40 minutes outside their city, paid for in cash, and never once mentioned to the wife he just informed was infertile through no fault of her own, a carefully constructed lie designed specifically to close off the possibility of children with Camille, while leaving every door open for the family he was quietly building with Vanessa instead. Camille grieved that loss privately for months, eventually finding a fragile peace with the idea that biological children simply weren't part of her future, never once questioning the medical explanation her husband had offered with such apparent sincerity and regret. 2 years later, entirely unaware of any contradiction, Camille discovered she was pregnant. She'd initially assumed the fatigue and nausea were stress-related, dismissing the possibility of pregnancy entirely, given what Devon had told her about his fertility. It was Camille's sister who finally insisted on a pregnancy test after weeks of Camille's unexplained symptoms, And the positive results sent Camille into a spiral of confused, cautious joy she brought immediately to Devon, expecting him to share in what felt to her like an impossible miraculous surprise. Devon's reaction in the moment revealed nothing of the panic actually unfolding behind his composed expression. He congratulated her carefully, suggested they confirm everything with a doctor before getting too excited, and then spent the following weeks in a state of controlled, methodical dread that Camille entirely mistook for careful optimism. What Devon knew, what Camille had no possible way of knowing, was that a vasectomy, however rare the failure rate, does occasionally fail to achieve permanent sterility, particularly when a man's own body, through a process doctors call spontaneous recanalization, gradually reopens the severed pathway over months or years without any outward symptom to indicate the procedure's failure. Devon had, unknowingly to everyone including himself, experienced exactly this kind of failure roughly 18 months after his vasectomy, a failure that made him, despite everything he'd told his wife, once again fully capable of fathering a child. But Devon didn't know that. As far as Devon understood his own medical situation, his vasectomy remained completely, permanently effective, which meant that when his wife discovered a pregnancy that should have been medically impossible, Devon Ashworth reached, with immediate and devastating certainty, for the only explanation his own carefully constructed lie allowed him to consider: Camille had been unfaithful. He never once questioned his own medical assumption. He never once considered that vasectomy failures, while rare, occurred at a documented rate that made his wife's pregnancy entirely medically plausible without any infidelity at all. Instead, over the following 7 months of Camille's pregnancy, Devon Ashworth constructed an entirely separate narrative in his mind, one he began with quiet and calculated deliberation, sharing with select friends and family members. His wife's pregnancy, framed carefully as a devastating betrayal he was struggling to process with dignity, evidence of an affair he was still gathering the strength to confront her about. Camille, entirely unaware of the suspicions silently building around her, spent those 7 months in genuine joy, decorating a nursery, attending prenatal appointments Devon increasingly found reasons to miss, planning a future with a husband she believed was simply anxious about impending fatherhood, rather than secretly convinced he was raising another man's child. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived with brutal, calculated timing, not privately, not with any opportunity for Camille to explain or defend herself, but in the delivery room itself, mere hours after their daughter's birth, delivered not as a conversation but as an abandonment, a single devastating text message left behind for a woman who had just given birth alone, believing until that exact moment that she was building a family with a husband who loved her. The 7 months that followed the abandonment were, Camille would later describe them, the hardest of her entire life. Devon's family, having received his carefully constructed version of events well before Camille had any opportunity to offer her own, largely sided with him immediately, several extended family members reaching out not with concern for Camille or her newborn daughter, but with pointed, accusatory questions about the affair Devon had told them she'd conducted. Their mutual social circle, absorbing the same one-sided narrative, quietly began excluding Camille from gatherings, uncomfortable with what several friends privately described as taking sides in a messy divorce. Camille's own father, a practical and protective man who had built his construction supply business from nothing, initially offered to hire an attorney and pursue an aggressive custody and support battle immediately. Camille, exhausted, grieving, and drowning in postpartum recovery while caring for a newborn entirely alone, initially resisted, still holding on to a fragile hope that Devon would eventually reconsider, would eventually want to know his daughter, would eventually recognize the mistake he'd made. That hope lasted almost a year, through repeated, unanswered attempts to include Devon in his daughter's life. Through a formal paternity acknowledgement request Devon's attorney flatly rejected without explanation. Through a birthday party for their daughter's first birthday that Devon didn't attend despite being invited. It was only when Camille discovered, through a mutual acquaintance, that Devon had quietly begun a relationship with a woman named Vanessa Kirchner, a relationship, she would later learn, that had actually predated their entire marriage, that the last of her hope for reconciliation finally, permanently died. "He's building an entire life with someone else," Camille told her sister, Renata, during one of the difficult calls that punctuated that first devastating year. "While I'm raising his daughter alone, being called a liar by everyone who used to be my friends." Then stop trying to prove anything to people who've already decided not to believe you, Renata said, her voice carrying the particular firmness of someone who had watched her sister absorb far too much unearned shame for far too long. Build something they can't argue with instead. It was advice Camille took slowly, methodically, over the following 5 years, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the patient, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life entirely on her own terms. She returned to her career in architectural design 8 months after her daughter Willa's birth, initially part-time, gradually building back toward full capacity as Willa grew old enough for reliable childcare. Camille had always been talented. Her instructors during graduate school had frequently praised her precise, thoughtful approach to sustainable residential design, but she had, in the years of her marriage, quietly deprioritized her own career ambitions in deference to Devon's, taking smaller commissions, turning down opportunities that would have required travel or extended hours, gradually allowing her professional identity to shrink to accommodate a marriage that, she now understood, had never genuinely valued what she brought to it. Freed from that quiet, ongoing compromise, Camille's career accelerated with a speed that surprised even her. She landed a series of increasingly prominent residential commissions, developed a specialization in accessible, multi-generational home design that filled a genuine gap in her city's architectural market, and within 3 years had left her position at a mid-sized firm to open her own independent practice, Ashworth Design Studio, built entirely around the values she'd always held but rarely had full authority to fully implement: thoughtful, sustainable, genuinely livable design over flashy, trend-driven aesthetics. The financial precarity of those early years as a single mother, however, remained a persistent, exhausting reality that no amount of professional success could immediately resolve. Devon, protected by an attorney who had aggressively contested any paternity acknowledgement from the very beginning, paid nothing toward Willa's support for the first 3 years of her life, a legal standoff Camille's own attorney explained would require a formal paternity test to resolve, a test Devon's legal team fought with the same calculated determination Devon had brought to every other aspect of his careful, compartmentalized deception. He's refusing the test because he genuinely believes it will confirm what he already believes, Camille's attorney, a measured, experienced family law specialist named Harriet Okonkwo, explained during one of their early consultations. Which means we need to force the issue through the court, because right now, he's using his own false certainty as a shield against any financial responsibility. The court-ordered paternity test, when it was finally compelled nearly 3.5 years after Willa's birth, arrived through a legal process considerably more mundane than the devastating hospital abandonment that had started everything: a scheduled cheek swab at a certified testing facility, results promised within 10 business days, the kind of routine bureaucratic procedure that gave no outward indication of the seismic consequences it was about to unleash. Devon, according to Harriet's later account of the proceedings, had appeared at the testing facility with visible, confident irritation, treating the entire process as an inconvenient formality he was confident would finally, definitively end Camille's harassment of his family with an outcome that would vindicate the story he'd been telling for over 3 years. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Harriet called Camille personally rather than simply forwarding the report. "Camille, I need you to sit down before I tell you this," Harriet began, her professional composure carrying an unmistakable undertone of barely contained astonishment. "The test confirms, with a probability exceeding 99.99%, that Devon Ashworth is Willa's biological father." Camille sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the confirmation of a truth she'd always privately known landing with less immediate relief than she'd expected, replaced almost instantly by a different, more urgent question. "How is that possible? He told me he had a vasectomy. He told everyone that. He's been telling people for 3 years that this is impossible." "That's actually the second thing I need to explain," Harriet said, because the testing facility flagged something unusual in Devon's own medical disclosure paperwork, which he was required to complete as part of the paternity dispute proceedings. Devon's own submitted medical records confirm a vasectomy procedure 6 years ago. But Camille, vasectomies do occasionally fail, a documented, if rare, medical phenomenon called spontaneous recanalization. Devon's paternity isn't scientifically impossible at all. Simply improbable. Improbable enough that he apparently never once questioned his own certainty, Not even enough to request a paternity test himself before destroying his marriage and abandoning his own daughter over an assumption that turns out to have been entirely catastrophically wrong. The revelation, once it became part of the official court record in the subsequent child support proceedings, didn't remain contained to the courtroom for long. Harriet's office, following standard legal procedure, formally notified Devon's attorney of the results, triggering a legal obligation for retroactive child support covering the full 3.5 years Devon had refused any financial responsibility. A sum that, once calculated with accumulated interest and legal penalties for willful non-payment, exceeded $90,000. But it was the human fallout, spreading through Devon's carefully compartmentalized social and professional world with the particular speed reserved for the most devastating kinds of gossip, that ultimately proved far more consequential than the financial judgment. Vanessa Kirchner, Devon's partner of nearly 6 years by that point, a relationship that had, unbeknownst to Camille throughout her entire marriage, predated the wedding itself, learned about the paternity confirmation not from Devon directly, but from a mutual colleague who'd heard about the court proceedings through the same small, interconnected professional circle that made secrets in their industry notoriously difficult to fully contain. What Vanessa discovered, piecing together the timeline with mounting, devastating clarity, wasn't simply that Devon had fathered a child during his marriage to Camille, a fact that, while painful, might have been survivable within the particular arrangement she and Devon had maintained for years. It was the far more damaging realization that Devon had spent the entirety of their relationship insisting, with the same calculated sincerity he'd once used to convince Camille of his infertility, that he desperately wanted to have children with Vanessa specifically, that their own repeated, unsuccessful attempts to conceive over the preceding 2 years represented a source of genuine grief he claimed to share with her. Grief that, Vanessa now understood with sickening clarity, Devon had known or at minimum strongly suspected, was medically possible to resolve, given that his vasectomy had demonstrably, provably failed years earlier. "He let me believe we had a fertility problem," Vanessa told Camille directly, in a conversation neither woman had ever expected to have, arranged awkwardly through Harriet's office once Vanessa's own attorney reached out seeking clarity on the timeline. "For 2 years I went through fertility specialists, hormone treatments, invasive testing, believing we were struggling together. And this entire time he knew, or at absolute minimum he should have known, that the procedure he told both of us had made children impossible had actually failed years earlier. He let me suffer through infertility treatment for a condition he might not have even had anymore, while telling you the opposite lie to justify abandoning you and his own daughter." The conversation, difficult and strange as it was between two women who had spent years positioned as adversaries in Devon's careful compartmentalization, marked an unexpected turning point. Vanessa, once she'd fully absorbed the scale of Devon's deception, a deception that had cost her years of genuine grief over a fertility struggle that may never have been medically necessary at all, ended their 6-year relationship within the month, providing in the process detailed testimony to Devon's attorney and eventually to Camille's legal team, that further undermined Devon's already collapsing credibility. Devon's professional world absorbed the fallout with similar unforgiving speed. His development firm, a mid-sized but well-regarded company built substantially on Devon's carefully cultivated reputation for trustworthy, detail-oriented client relationships, began quietly distancing itself once the paternity case details, filtered through the same interconnected professional gossip network that had reached Vanessa, became impossible to fully contain. 2 major clients, according to industry sources Camille heard about only secondhand, specifically cited concerns about Devon's judgment and honesty when declining to renew ongoing contracts, decisions that ultimately contributed to Devon's quiet departure from the firm less than a year after the paternity results became public. Camille, throughout the months of legal proceedings and unfolding fallout, found herself experiencing something considerably more complicated than the simple vindication she might have expected to feel. There was relief, certainly, the profound relief of finally having undeniable, scientifically confirmed proof that she had never been the liar Devon's carefully constructed narrative had painted her as for over 3 years. But there was also a fresh, unexpected grief, mourning not the loss of a marriage she'd already fully processed losing, but the years Willa had spent without a father who, it now turned out, had never had any legitimate reason to doubt his own paternity in the first place. "I keep thinking about all the birthdays he missed," Camille told her therapist, Dr. Adiz Nwosu, during one of their regular sessions roughly a year into the child support proceedings. Not because I want him back in our lives now. I don't. But because Willa spent her entire early childhood without a father who abandoned her over a mistake that was entirely his own doing. His own lie. His own failure to question his own certainty. She deserved better than that, even if I'm grateful in hindsight that we built our life without him. Those two things can both be true simultaneously, Dr. Nwosu observed. You can grieve what Willa lost while also recognizing that the life you built in his absence has genuine, independent value. Grief and gratitude aren't mutually exclusive. Camille carried that framing forward as Willa grew older, gradually finding a way to hold both truths without letting either one diminish the other. She built, over the following 2 years, a life that felt increasingly, genuinely complete on its own terms rather than defined in relation to what Devon had taken from her. Ashworth Design Studio grew steadily, earning a regional design award for a multi-generational housing development Camille had spent nearly a year developing, a project specifically designed to accommodate aging parents, adult children, and grandchildren within a single thoughtfully connected but genuinely private living space, work that reflected, Camille often noted, exactly the kind of intentional, honest family structure she'd once hoped for in her own marriage and had, in a different form, entirely, ultimately built for herself and Willa instead. She reconnected, during this period of steady rebuilding, with a former graduate school classmate named Julian Reyes, a structural engineer she'd occasionally collaborated with professionally over the years, whose own marriage had ended in an amicable divorce roughly 18 months before their professional paths crossed again on a joint residential project. Their working relationship developed slowly into friendship, and eventually, with the same careful, unhurried deliberation Camille brought to every major decision in her rebuilt life, into something more. "You don't have to explain your history to me in detail if you're not ready," Julian told her early in their relationship, once Camille had cautiously begun sharing pieces of what had happened with Devon. "But I want you to know I'm not going anywhere the moment things get complicated. I've watched you build an entire career and raise an incredible kid essentially alone. That's not something that makes me nervous. It makes me want to actually earn a place in that life, not just assume I deserve one." The retroactive child support judgment, finalized roughly 14 months after the initial paternity confirmation, provided Camille with resources she used deliberately, purposefully, not for any extravagant lifestyle change, but to establish a dedicated education fund for Willa, to finally pay off the remaining debt from her graduate school years that she'd been slowly chipping away at for over a decade, and to hire her first full-time employee at Ashworth Design Studio, expanding a practice that had, until that point, existed entirely as a one-woman operation sustained through sheer determination and increasingly long working hours. Devon, meanwhile, according to updates that reached Camille only occasionally through the same professional and social circles that had once excluded her, spent the following years in a slow, steady decline considerably more thorough than any single dramatic confrontation could have accomplished. He left his development firm under circumstances several industry sources described only vaguely as mutual agreement, took a considerably less prestigious position at a smaller regional firm, and according to the last update Camille heard secondhand roughly 3 years after the paternity results became public, had never remarried, his social circle having gradually, quietly contracted around the singular, difficult-to-escape reputation of a man who had abandoned his own pregnant wife based on a certainty that turned out to be entirely provably wrong. Willa, now nearly 7 years old, occasionally asked questions about her father that Camille answered with the same careful, age-appropriate honesty she'd committed to from the beginning, not painting Devon as a villain in dramatic, embittered terms, but offering Willa an honest, straightforward account calibrated to what a child could actually process, that her father had made a serious mistake, that he had believed something untrue, and let that belief keep him from being part of her life, and that whatever happened between the adults involved, it had never once been Willa's fault. "Do you think he'll ever want to meet me?" Willa asked one evening, during one of the occasional conversations that arose organically rather than through any formal, scheduled discussion Camille had planned. "I don't know, sweetheart," Camille answered honestly. "That's a choice only he can make. But I want you to understand something important. Whatever he decides, it doesn't change how loved and how wanted you've always been. You have me, you have Uncle Julian who cares about you so much, you have your grandparents, your Aunt Renata. You have never once been missing a family, even on the days it might feel that way. Devon did eventually reach out, not through any grand gesture, but through a carefully worded letter delivered through Harriet's office roughly 4 years after the paternity confirmation, requesting, tentatively, the possibility of supervised visitation as Willa grew older. Camille consulted extensively with Dr. Nwosu, with Harriet, and eventually, once Willa was old enough to meaningfully participate in the conversation, with her daughter directly, ultimately agreeing to a slow, carefully structured process of supervised meetings that prioritized Willa's comfort and pace above any obligation Camille felt toward reconciling anything on Devon's behalf. "I'm not doing this for him," Camille told Renata, during one of their regular calls discussing the tentative arrangement. "I'm doing it because Willa deserves the chance to know her own history on her own terms, even if what she ultimately decides is that she doesn't want an ongoing relationship with him. That has to be her choice to make, not a debt I'm paying on his behalf." 6 years after the devastating hospital abandonment that had started everything, Camille stood in the newly expanded offices of Ashworth Design Studio, now a team of 6, working on a portfolio of projects spanning 3 states. Watching Willa color quietly at a small desk in the corner of Camille's office, a routine after-school arrangement that had become one of Camille's favorite parts of her working week. Julian arrived to pick them both up for dinner, as he did most Thursday evenings now, greeting Willa with the easy, genuine warmth that had characterized their relationship from its earliest days, before turning to Camille with the particular smile she'd come to associate, over the past 3 years together, with genuine partnership rather than the careful, compartmentalized performance she'd once mistaken for love. "Good day?" he asked, glancing around the studio's expanded workspace with visible pride. "A good 6 years," Camille said, and found, watching her daughter carefully add a bright yellow sun to her drawing, that the observation felt entirely uncomplicatedly true. She had lost, in a single devastating hospital abandonment, the marriage she'd once believed would define her entire future. She had gained, in the 6 years since, a career built entirely on her own terms, a daughter who had never once doubted she was loved completely, and a partnership with a man who had chosen, deliberately and consistently, to earn rather than assume his place in her life. The DNA report that had finally exposed Devon's carefully constructed lie hadn't just proven Willa's paternity. It had proven, with the same scientific certainty, exactly how much Devon had been willing to destroy: a wife, a mistress, a daughter, an entire professional reputation, rather than simply question his own certainty for the 10 business days a routine test would have required. The truth, once it finally arrived, hadn't just cleared Camille's name. It had shown, unmistakably, exactly how much devastation one man's refusal to doubt himself could ultimately cause, and exactly how much a woman could build, quietly and deliberately, in the years he spent running from it. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the very end. If Camille's journey from public shame to quiet, deliberate vindication moved you, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories about hidden truths, resilient rebuilding, and the justice that sometimes arrives through evidence rather than confrontation, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. What would you have done in Camille's position? Tell me below.